Welcome to today's Economy Committee meeting where we will be discussing food insecurity in London. Please could I ask everyone to switch your electrical devices to silent mode to avoid any interruptions this morning. Can I now ask the Clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the Economy Committee meeting held on the 7th of September 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings and the additional correspondence received? Thank you. And can I ask the committee to note the responses from the Mayor as outlined in the report?
Noted.
Thank you so much. And just for anyone who's watching from home, we are going to be adjourning this meeting till 10:15, so we'll be back at 10:15. Thank you. Morning, everyone. Sorry about the delay. We are now going to be moving on to the main item of business, the discussion with invited guests on food insecurity in London. Now, it's important to note that this meeting also falls during London Challenge Poverty Week, a chance for us to all highlight the issue of poverty in the capital. I'd like to welcome our panel of guests today. Tom Rahilly, Assistant Director for Communities and Social Policy for the GLA. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice. Sabine Goodwin, Coordinator for the Independent Food Aid Network. Pam Warhurst, Founder of Incredible Edible. And Anna Taylor, Executive Director for the Food Foundation, who joins us on Zoom today. Thank you all. And joining us from the Trussell Trust, we will have later Heather. Sorry, she's here. Yeah, sorry. Confusing. We have Heather Buckingham, Interim Head of Policy and Research. And we will be joined later by Elida Kakir, who's the Stories Officer, and we also are really pleased that we'll be joined by a service user, Sharron. So they will be just joining us quietly at the start. Now, we're going to be kicking off with a question from myself, and it's going to be to Heather, Sabine, Anna and Pam to begin with. What are the main causes of food insecurity and food bank use in London? Do you want to start, Sabine?
I can start, that's fine. Well, first of all, it's important to say that there was a food insecurity crisis in London and the rest of the UK way before the pandemic. We know that 43% of households on universal credit were food insecure, according to DWP Family Resources Survey data. Since there was a huge spike in need at the start of the pandemic, but since the cut to universal credit and the cost of living crisis emerged in the last year, the need for food banks and charitable food aid providers has increased dramatically. And we know that it's lack of income that's doing that. We know that it's the fact that benefit payments aren't sufficient. We know that sanctions are causing people to need food banks. We know that the benefit cap is a problem. We know that the two-child limit is a problem. And we know that inadequate wages and lack of job security is causing a rise in the need for food banks. And we know that no recourse to public fund status is a huge problem in London, and many of our food banks are supporting people who are just not able to manage with the very little money that they're able to access that way. So this is a problem that has been getting worse and worse over more than a decade, but is reaching crisis point now as, in our case, food banks are struggling to cope with the levels of demand, and their capacity is being stretched to the point of, needing to reduce the size of their parcels, needing to consider how they could, not being able to really imagine how they're going to be able to cope, and having to contemplate the thought of maybe having to turn people away if this need increases further, which is likely to do without question if something dramatic is not done. First and foremost, of course, that benefit payments must be increased in line with inflation as soon as possible. I'll leave it there for now.
Pam?
I'm no expert in the details of food security, poverty and justice in London, but I have a little experience of people in general. What I would say is that everything that's been said is incredibly important, but I would go back even further than that. That the bedrock for so many of our current problems are our inability to engage in a creative way people in their everyday lives in access to good food, in an understanding of what to do with good food, in the opportunity to grow and share and be respected as the entrepreneurs in the food industry that they could well be, and which their communities so badly need. So my experience has been that there is an absolute need, of course, in this conversation for how do we deal with that immediate problem. And everything that's been said in terms of access to the right sort of economic opportunities, the access to support mechanisms, the access to hubs, centres and the like, and investment in those is absolutely true. But I would say that to do that in isolation from an investment in an individual's ability to gain respect for themselves and their community through a knowledge and the opportunity to access good food is also incredibly important. I would say that in general, for decades, not just a decade, people have been separated from that knowledge. There's been no investment in their skill sets. There's been no encouragement in what we're going to need in the future, which is more localised supply chains, more access to more local food and the like. And so my experience relates to that longer-term systemic problem we've got in terms of the human relationship to food and place. And we are not squaring the circle that allows people to find that, be part of the solution to how they get out of that food trap, that food poverty trap. And one of the ways that I think that we can do that, I'm not going to go into it now, we may explore it later, is to rethink the relationship of citizen and land, particularly the public realm.
Heather.
Well, firstly, thank you for the opportunity to join the conversation this morning. As I'm sure many of you will know, the Trussell Trust supports a nationwide network of food banks across the UK, and we campaign for change to end the need for food banks in the UK too. There are 39 Trussell Trust food bank charities in Greater London, and between them they operate 135 food bank distribution centres. And as I'm sure we'll all be aware, that's just one part of London's much larger emergency food provision landscape. So in responding to this question, I just want to be very clear that at the Trussell Trust, our focus is really on the financial access part of food insecurity as it's defined here. And I'm sure that others will be able to speak more fully to the question of physical access to food. But the reason for that is because what our data tell us is that for people turning to food banks in our network, low income and very low income is the primary reason for that. So our State of Hunger research programme found that 95% of people using Trussell Trust food banks meet the criteria for destitution, which means that they're unable to afford essentials like food, heating, lighting, accommodation, and so on. And when we look at that data for London specifically, that rises to 97% of people using Trussell Trust food banks. The average income after housing costs amongst households referred to a food bank is around £57 a week. And when we look at what's behind these very low incomes, there are a number of factors that stand out. So firstly, and most significantly, I would suggest, are problems with the UK social security system. According to research that we commissioned between 2008 and 2020, the majority of people referred to Trussell Trust food banks in London were in receipt of benefit income, 76%. And the problems that we see with the social security system have to do both with the sufficiency of benefits and with some of the processes involved in the system. So from a sufficiency perspective, a working-age single person on universal credit with no dependents will receive only 43% of the minimum income standard that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation sets out as the essential income necessary for a minimum acceptable standard of living. And then from a process perspective, our research has found that 15% of people referred to food banks in London said they were waiting for universal credit payments. And we know that deductions from benefits also contribute to people being unable to afford the essentials. So, for example, where an advance payment is being repaid or where an overpayment of benefits is being repaid. But secondly, and really importantly too, ill health, disability and adverse life events are playing a really important part in people's experience of low income and food insecurity. 64% of working age people referred to Trussell food banks in early 2020 were disabled, which is more than 3 times the figure for the general working population. 51% of households referred had someone with poor mental health. People using our food banks are also more likely than the general population to have severe disabilities that limit their daily activities a lot. And so for people who find themselves in that position, the quality of our social security system is clearly crucial when it comes to ensuring their financial access to food, as well as other dimensions of their well-being as well. A couple of other things to mention are debt repayments to public and private bodies. We know that levels of indebtedness are high amongst people accessing our food banks in London. Housing costs also play a significant part in that problem. So, for example, 4 in 10 renters referred to Trussell food banks during the period of our research had to top up the benefits that they were receiving specifically for the housing costs from other sources of income to help pay their rent. So we know that there are challenges to do with housing costs that are putting pressure on people's ability to afford other essentials. And finally, caring responsibilities also play a part, sometimes making it impossible for people to secure income through the labour market.
Thank you so much. We're being joined by Anna Taylor on Zoom. Anna, we'd like to hear from you too.
Good morning. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. I won't elaborate further from the excellent presentations which both Heather and Sabine have given on the kind of causes of food insecurity, but I think it might be helpful to add a little bit more in terms of our understanding of the scale of the situation, food insecurity situation right now. We as an organisation have been tracking food insecurity since the start of the pandemic. We've now done 11 rounds of surveys. These are at the national level. For some of the data, we can disaggregate it for London, but not for all of it. So to build on Heather's comments, our data shows that in the last month, 5% of Londoners have visited a food bank, but there are 18% of Londoners who are food insecure. So I think what Heather will be seeing in food banks and Sabine in food banks is obviously we know the tip of the iceberg in terms of the real scale of the problem which people are facing right now. And so by food insecurity, we mean people who have adults who've reported skipping a meal, going for a whole day without eating, or going hungry and not eating in the last month. This is a standard method that's used. It was been used by the GLA in the past and is used by the government in tracking food insecurity. What's important to note is that there has been a very significant increase in the last 6 months, a 50% increase, in fact, since the spring. So that figure that's 18% now was 12% back in April. And I think perhaps another point to draw out, which hasn't come out very strongly in the comments so far, is the situation for households with children. We know that having a child is a really big risk factor for food insecurity. At the national level now, 1 in 4 households with children have experienced food insecurity in the past month. So the rates tend to be 60% higher amongst households with children compared to households without children. And we're concerned that some of the measures which the government has put in place at the national level so far to protect people through the cost of living crisis have involved these flat payments, which are the same whether you're a 1-person household or a 5-person household. And what we see when we break down our data in terms of the numbers of children is that you have levels of food insecurity at 16% if you've got no children, rising to 42% if you have 3 or more children. It's a very steady rise with every additional child that you have. And so that creates an additional urgency around making sure that we have the right safety nets in place, in addition to the measures that the other panelists have mentioned around social security being, obviously making sure that benefits rise in line with inflation and addressing some of the other problems which have been highlighted, but really thinking about how we make sure that children, because they're growing here and now every day and they're developing in school, that they're not essentially sacrificed in this whole big picture of how we deal with the cost of living crisis and what the measures are that can be put in place to protect them. A couple of other very small comments. Heather mentioned disability. Our data shows that food insecurity levels are extremely high in households with a disabled adult, 45%, in comparison to 18% in the general population. They're a particularly high risk factor, as are being in receipt of universal credit, as Sabine mentioned. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The picture that all of you have really described is not good. And the data that you have provided us is going to be really useful for our report. So I really am so grateful for all of your work and time and presenting these quite dark facts. Now, I'm so pleased that Sharron's joined us today. Thank you so much for coming all the way here to City Hall. We really appreciate it. And we do really want to hear your voice. Your voice is so important, and we're really grateful that you're willing to talk to us about your experience of food insecurity, a little bit about the effect that it's had on you and your health and your well-being. Please tell us a little bit about your experience.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I do apologise I was late. It was due to the train. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm hoping that I can tell my story and my experience that hopefully will create some form of change, which I definitely do think is required. So in question 1, please can you tell us about your experience with food security and the effect that this had on your mental health? So my experience has mainly been when I've been unemployed and on benefits, and mainly on universal credit. When I was on the old benefit, JSA, you could survive as you received money fortnightly. In October 2019, during Brexit, I became unemployed, and I was already anxious about going on to universal credit after hearing all the awful experiences people were suffering. I tried really hard to get a job as I didn't want to apply for it, but after a while, I had no choice. You have to wait 5 weeks for your first payment, which effectively puts you into debt. Then you have no alternative but to apply for the advance loan to pay for your rent and your bills, leaving you further in debt as they start the deductions from your first initial payment. The money is simply not enough, and it is not a safety net as once designed. You have to decide what you're going to pay for and what you're going to have to leave, again creating more debt. Priorities are rent and the phone bill, and then shopping. In terms of food, your dietary requirements change due to the money you have left over. I started eating a lot of cheap, unhealthy food as it was cheap. I still had a car, so I would go to Tesco's late in the evening when they would have a reduced section. That's when I would get the good food. When you struggle to feed yourself, you feel powerless, small, and inadequate. With the other stresses, this just exacerbates the problem. It's like a vicious cycle, and it starts to beat you down. Your self-esteem, confidence, and identity as a person. My mental health was quickly affected, and I became depressed. My eating habits became irregular, and I had to start skipping meals. For instance, I had a job interview, and I had enough money either for a meal or for travel fares. So I opted for travel as I was desperate for a job and to improve my current situation. On that day, I made the interview into the city, but the money wasn't enough, and I got stranded in central London. Stress and anxiety begins to take hold, compounded by everything else. You feel low to the point of thinking, I'm a failure.
Thank you so much, Sharron. I'm really grateful for you sharing that story. It can't be easy. And what you're saying is probably going to resonate with a lot of people who are going through this experience. There are many causes that our guests have already talked about, but I'd like to know a little bit about what you think. What do you think are the causes for people who are struggling, like you've just said earlier, about not being able to afford the food that you want to live on? And why do you think that the use of food banks in London is happening here now in such an increased number?
Okay, is that question 2? Okay, so question 2. In terms of benefit system, and universal credit, it simply doesn't work in its current state and needs urgent reform. The money is not enough and you spiral into debt very fast. If you have friends and family, you become reliant on them, and it puts pressure on them to support you, which can strain relationships. Luckily, I was fortunate, many others are not. I was literally begging, but not on the street, to the public. Universal credit must be increased with inflation, especially with the high cost of living rises, such as the news today. This is very worrying. Majority of the claimants are in work, and again, the reason people are struggling is because of low wages and 0-hour contracts. People are working should be able to cover their basic needs and essentials. Food, light, and keeping warm are basic needs. Give people proper wages that are in line with today's inflation. I know both working people and those unemployed are using food banks.
So I'm going to ask question 3 now, and it's about what you think needs to change so that everyone in London is able to access sufficient amount of healthy food.
I would say 1, increase salary in line with today's inflation. 2, increase universal credit in line with today's inflation. 3, review 0-hour contracts. 4, supermarkets must try to keep prices down. And 5, affordable rents.
Thank you so much. Sharron, we're going to move on to Assembly Member Ahmed, who's going to ask some of the other guests some questions, and then we'll come back to you for your final comments. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, panel. And Sharron, thank you very much. That was incredibly moving, just listening to you talking about your experience there. And I've been making quite copious notes about what you've said. Thank you. My first question is to the Deputy Mayor. Deputy Mayor, the 2021-2022 survey of Londoners suggests that food insecurity levels in London have decreased since 2019. What do you think that this decrease can be attributed to?
Thank you for your question. So the survey of Londoners provided a snapshot of a period of field work that covered November 2021 to around January or February 2022. And in that survey, we were asking around 8,600 adults about their experiences of food insecurity of the previous 12 months. And what we clearly have found, and some of our findings were also replicated in a DWP survey, which covered the same period, was that food insecurity levels had lessened to around 16% of adults in comparison to around 21% of adults when we conducted the first iteration of the survey back in 2019. Now, we surmise, and I think it's really important because obviously we must never try to assume causation, direct causation, but we surmise that the reason for that dip or that decrease was largely to do with the protections that were afforded to people during the pandemic by the government. So the government during the pandemic, as you all know, introduced the furlough scheme, but also incredibly important for people on the very lowest incomes was the £20 per week uplift to universal credit. And we know that that uplift on its own provided many Londoners and many individuals across the country with a really essential lifeline, frankly, during that period of time. Unfortunately, we know that the £20 per week uplift was subsequently removed around the time that we were conducting the research. But we definitely would assume, as far as we can, that that finding that we had related specifically to that. I think What's also additionally important, and it's really good that we have the Food Foundation speaking here today, is that food insecurity has rocketed during the past year. We certainly know from our own research, even though the Survey of Londoners hasn't captured food insecurity levels after the period of time in which the fieldwork was being conducted, so after February 2022. What we do know is that people are really struggling financially. And given that we know that food insecurity is a manifestation of financial hardship and poverty, if people are suffering financially, that is likely to have a huge impact on their abilities to be able to access and afford food. So since around January, we have, in polling, found that around 35% of Londoners are saying that they're financially struggling. We fast forward to August, and that figure has rocketed to 50% of Londoners who are financially struggling. And we also know that there are particular communities as well in London who are really experiencing the cost of living crisis disproportionately heavily in comparison to others. So Black Londoners, for example, around a third of Black Londoners say that they are finding it difficult to make ends meet. Around a third of deaf and disabled Londoners are finding it difficult to make ends meet, and around a quarter of Asian Londoners are finding it difficult to make ends meet. So the Survey of Londoners is a really good snapshot of that period of time and looking back into the way in which individuals were experiencing the pandemic, but it doesn't account for the impact that the cost of living crisis is having on Londoners at the moment.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. If I could just follow up from that and ask the panel, do you agree with what the Survey of Londoners has said and what the Deputy Mayor has just said? And what do you think needs to happen to address this? I know you've made some comments about this, but if we could go a bit further into this. So if we could start with Heather, please.
Yes, so we can certainly see within our food bank use data some of the mitigating effects that we've heard about around the £20 uplift and also the cost of living payments that have been made this year. But we are seeing a picture of growing food bank use through this year, and we're expecting from our current figures to see one of our busiest, in fact our busiest winter on record. So we are very concerned about escalating the escalating level to which people are being unable to afford the essentials. And as Anna said earlier, when we're thinking about food bank use, that is just one part of the food insecurity picture. But yes, as I say, we can see the impact that some of those measures that the government have taken has had. Is difficult to be entirely clear about causation, but that's why we would continue to say that intervention within the social security system is a really important part of how we need to continue to tackle this problem.
Thank you. Pam.
Again, sticking to my knitting, what I think we need to do, obviously agree with all that, and it's deeply shocking, and we'd be hearing similar stories, I think, in Manchester or Leeds or over the country. But from my point of view and my experience, it's about also contributing to the dialogue around how you use your assets. From my point of view, with 15 years' experience through Incredible Edible, which was set up as a means of empowering people through their own actions in their own communities to do what they could around food to nurture themselves and their neighbours, it's very clear that if obstacles are taken away from communities' ability to grow and know how to produce meals for their families, and if we were to rethink the relationship between those communities and their public realm, and we were to develop a respectful conversation between citizen and state around the use of that land to feed those communities, we would start to, I believe, unlock a different way of developing our strategic thinking around some of these big issues. I only have one piece of a jigsaw. It's a big picture. I'm an economist, not even an environmental. I get all of this. This is absolutely fundamental. But from my point of view, when there is an immediate need not only to address food insecurity, but a sense of purpose of an individual, of well-being of an individual, of being part of a solution as an individual, not a victim, the use of the public realm and an investment in a citizen's ability to feed themselves from that public realm in times of real crisis is incredibly important. And the bottom line is, it's not going to cost a right lot. You've just got to have the will to do it. And whatever we think the situation is now, the gun to our temple of climate change is going to require that we have a more radical systemic approach to how we use our assets and how we invest in those other assets that are important in our communities, which are our people.
Thank you,
That would be my
Pam.
bottom line.
Apologies, we're a bit short of time. Thank you. If I could move to Anna, please.
Yes, thank you. Just to respond to the Deputy Mayor's comments around the survey of Londoners, I think her analysis is right, and we see the same. There's evidence in the national data that there was this protective effect of the universal credit uplift. There's still a number of academic studies going on to really disentangle some of the possible reasons for that, exactly how that plays out. I don't think we have a firm conclusion on that, but as the Deputy Mayor said, the data indicates that was a really important protective factor, and we see that in the food insecurity data. The survey for Londoners has cited a level of food insecurity of 16% in the year running up to January 2022. And this was a 1-year recall period, which tends to capture more experiences of food insecurity than a shorter recall period, because people go in and out of these experiences over time as family pressures mount and then ease a little. Our data, as I said, shows 18% in the last month for the month of September 2022. And so, in fact, that's not just a sort of equivalent of a 2 percentage point jump from January, because the equivalent data point in the survey for Londoners would be significantly lower than the 16%, which the Deputy Mayor cited. So, that's just a sort of point of fact in terms of thinking about how you compare those numbers. And as I said previously, our data shows something like a 50% increase in food insecurity in that period from January to now. So really keep that in mind when you're looking at the survey for Londoners data. From our perspective, in terms of really, obviously, the measures which need to be put in place to strengthen the benefit system are paramount and obvious and simple for the government to actually deal with, in terms of they have a system which allows you to reach the right people with the finances which they need through the benefit system. And I would be urging the GLA to make the case in the strongest possible terms for that action on behalf of Londoners to be taken, recognising that your own levers of power are limited directly. Two other areas that I think it's important to highlight. One is around free school meals. I made the point earlier that children are particularly at risk, households with children. Some boroughs, as you know, have taken the steps to fund the expansion of free school meals to all primary school children, which is already showing to have really quite significant protective effects and health benefits as well. So again, I would be urging the GLA to do as much as they can to share that experience across other boroughs, explore with other boroughs whether or not they can move in a similar direction, and also be putting pressure on the Department for Education to really seriously consider the expansion of free school meals, at the very least, to all children who are from households in receipt of universal credit, because there's very many children, an estimated 800,000 in England, who are living in poverty but don't currently qualify for means-tested free school meals. And the third point, which really builds on some of Pam's suggestions are that if you're on a very low income, not your income is your primary problem, but the food environment in which you're making decisions about what to eat is also making the situation worse for you, because the least healthy foods are the cheapest, and because they're the ones which are most heavily promoted and most convenient for you. And so actually your ability to be able to kind of break free of that system, food environment around you is constrained because you have little income. But really we also need those food environments, whether it's the retail offer or the takeaway offer, to be more conducive to allowing citizens to really take control of their decisions and buy the things which they want to buy to protect their health. And at the moment we've got a problem with that as well, and that is something which the GLA has shown considerable leadership on in the past, and could be something which is strengthened further going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. And Sabine, if you could answer that as well, please.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of what the Deputy Mayor said, absolutely that makes sense in terms of the analysis. And when you look at the DWP data from the Family Resources Survey, from the year up to the end of March 2020, and then compared to the year up to March 2021, you can see a 16% drop in food insecurity from households with the universal credit. So 27 households on universal credit reporting food insecurity at a level of 27% instead of 43%. So still very high and uncomfortably and impossibly high, but you can see very clearly the impact of the cash-first intervention of the uplift to universal credit. So the DWP's own data shows that addressing people's income immediately reduces people's food insecurity. We see that the levels of food insecurity are going up. I couldn't agree more that what we see as our food banks, 115 independent food banks across London, is the tip of the iceberg, and we need to be focusing on poverty and addressing poverty. And what more can be done? I mean, great measures have been put in place by the GLA, but much more needs to be done. And we need to be seeing a huge investment in advice services, cash-first payments from each individual local authority. That the first port of call is the local authority, and payments that will help people to be able to afford food for themselves. So there's not a default ending up at a food bank or at another type of charitable food aid provider. We need to be thinking about the real living wage, ensuring that every employer across every borough is paying a real living wage. And when supermarkets are getting involved with food poverty issues, that their first priority is to ensure that their workers, whether they're their employers or their subcontracted workers, are able to afford food themselves. That must be their first action, so that we don't need to be supporting Asda workers or Tesco workers or other supermarket workers in our food banks. Sorry.
Thank you, Sabine. My apologies to the Chair. As we can see, I've managed to skip a question, so I will now go back to the question that I was first meant to ask. So this is to Heather, Sabine and Anna. What impact are rising inflation and cost of living pressures having on levels of food insecurity? And I'd like you to answer that also in terms of the mini budget on the 23rd of September, and whether that actually has caused problems, or is it too early to tell? So if we could start with you, Anna, please.
Yeah, sure. So food price inflation is absolutely making the situation even worse for families. I mean, obviously not just food prices, energy prices as well. The CPI published the latest data today, showing that food price inflation is now at 14.5% and is the second biggest driver of overall inflation. We've been tracking a basket of goods, a Tesco basket of goods, a kind of basic basket that meets broad nutritional parameters since April of this year. And in that time, food prices have gone up just in that 6 months, more than 15%. So our data suggests that the CPI is a sort of mixed bag of goods. It doesn't necessarily reflect a a basket that a family might buy. And I think our data is showing that those food price rises are even steeper for that basic basket of goods. In terms of being able to judge the effects of the mini budget, it is, from our perspective and the data that we have, it's too early to see those effects. But obviously, in terms of interest rates, we can expect that those will start to flow through very quickly in terms of the impact on households' ability to make ends meet. So yeah, I think, and I don't think we're able to say with any certainty yet from the data, but there's obviously very good reason to expect the situation is going to get worse. In fact, the Institute of Fiscal Studies is now predicting that food inflation will reach 17% in the first quarter of next year. So, and as I said, it's at 14.5% now. So a continued rise in food price inflation is fully expected in the coming months.
Thank you, Anna. If we could go to Sabine next, please.
It is hard to be sure at this point, but our most recent data was published last week, and we're seeing steady increases all the time across the UK. But what we're seeing that is very worrying indeed is the points around capacity of our food aid providers, and they are 1 in 4 reported having to reduce the size of their food parcels in the previous 3 months. They are having to dip into financial reserves. Donations have fallen, both financial and food donations have fallen. And, they're running on empties quite a lot of the time, and it's very, very difficult for them to see how they can manage. It's also having an effect on their volunteers. Some volunteers aren't able to keep volunteering because they need to take up work themselves. They can't afford the petrol to do the delivery of or picking up of food. And we know that people who used to donate to food banks are now having to use them themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. And yesterday I launched my childhood hunger report, and what we heard there was that it's not just people have not been able to donate, but it's actually food bank staff themselves now who are relying on food banks to feed themselves and their families. And finally, Heather.
Thank you. I think it's hard to understate the impact that both rising inflation and the current cost of living crisis is having on people who are needing to turn to food banks in our network for support, and also those who are at risk of needing to use a food bank. And the message that we're hearing from food banks in our network is that people are really scared. And they're not just scared about what's coming, they're scared about what's happening now. And our food banks in London are really concerned that we are heading into a winter where many more people are going to be tipped into destitution and into needing their support. And based on some of the stats we've already heard, it's not hard to see why. It's because people on very low incomes simply don't have flex or margin in their budget. So we are talking about people therefore being unable to afford the essentials. And there have been some really welcome steps from the government to address this situation, but really without further support, this is going to fall far short of the pressing needs that we're seeing. We really don't believe that food banks are the answer to this problem. It is about the income that people have available to them. Perhaps just to underline the severity of the situation, I can share a couple of findings from a survey that we ran in August of people on universal credit, and we've been able to pull out the London-based respondents from that. 30% of people in receipt of universal credit in London had more than one day in the last month when they didn't eat at all or had only one meal because they could not afford to buy food. And around 2 in 5 of those people said they had to skip meals in order to keep up with other essential costs. 1 in 5 saying that they're not able to cook hot food because they couldn't afford to use the oven or other cooking facilities. So these are huge concerns, and As I said earlier, we saw a large spike in need for our food banks during the pandemic, as many organisations that were providing services did. But what our data for August and September this year are indicating to us is that we are going to see our busiest winter ever this year, which is deeply concerning. Just on your point about the mini budget, as I said, the intervention around energy costs is certainly very welcome. I know that's been scaled back now in terms of its duration, and it will be really important for us to and for the people that we're working with, that we get a speedy announcement about what the targeted measures are going to be following on from that. But as Anna said, we are expecting the impacts, the knock-on impacts from mortgage interest rates going up to have a big impact on people's ability to afford the essentials, including renters' ability to afford the essentials. It is too early to say from a kind of database perspective what those impacts have been and will be, but it's certainly something that we're very concerned about looking to the future.
Thank you very much. And that was very salutary listening from all of you and very concerning. Anna, I have a couple of questions to ask you directly. The first is, what is the impact of the government's holiday activities and food programme been in addressing holiday hunger and child food insecurity in London? And are there any gaps in support for children during school holidays?
Thank you very much. I don't think I'm in a position to give you a specific London view, but I can give you a view on the holiday activities and food programme nationally at the England level. Just sort of recap on what that programme is. It's aimed to reach children who are eligible for free school meals during term time. It's aimed to reach them in the holidays. The funding it provides the equivalent of support for a 6-week period of holidays over the entire year, offering support during the summer, winter and Easter breaks. So 6 weeks being spread over that period. So it's not kind of full-time support in that sense. I believe the evaluation that was conducted this summer showed that I think it showed that 30% of free school meal children actually accessed the scheme. Obviously, this is an optional scheme for families to opt into or opt out of, and so you wouldn't expect it to be 100%. But I think also what the evidence seems to suggest is that the provision is quite mixed in terms of the extent to which it is readily available across different local authorities, because it's the way that which it's implemented is led by local authorities, which is obviously one of its strengths, because it means that local authorities can really design the scheme in the way which suits their local community. But obviously in practice, you would then have a sort of fairly mixed picture in terms of provision. I think what also different local authorities have been doing is supplementing the HAF scheme with the use of the Household Support Fund in the form of vouchers for families or cash support for households with children that are eligible for free school meals. So there's been a bit of a supplement to what's available through HAF. But obviously that supplement at the moment is temporary. Whereas HAF has funding in place for a 3-year period, and we've had 1 year, so 2 more years for which the funding is committed. I think the other important thing to note about HAF is that not only does it provide a nutritious meal for children, but also a set of enriching activities, and these are really, really important. The evaluation shows that families really value these activities that their children can participate in. And it also helps with childcare over the holidays. So in other words, cost relieving is sort of wider multiplier effects, if you like, from that provision. So overall, our view is the HAF scheme is a fantastic scheme. It's still early days in terms of really reaching all the children that it needs to reach. And I think there's a real case for making sure, and this could be something done, through the GLA, that lessons are really shared across boroughs about how the scheme is implemented so that it can really maximise its impact.
Thank you. Just following up for that, the government food strategy that was released in June 2022 mentions free school meals just 3 times, and there was, as we know, no real expansion of policies. Did you find that disappointing? And if so, did you? Is there anything that you would suggest that strategy should have contained?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the recommendations that were in the independent review led by Henry Dimbleby were that free school meals should be expanded to more children living in poverty as a first step. And that recommendation has thus far been not acted upon by the government on the grounds that extending free school meals is unaffordable. Last week, in fact, Impact on Urban Health published some analysis which they'd commissioned PwC to do, looking at the cost benefit of investment on free school meals. And that evidence really now shows that the argument that this is unaffordable is unfounded, because free school meals will actually deliver a net economic benefit rather than a drain in terms of finances. In fact, the most conservative estimates within the PwC report show that £1 into extending free school meals delivers £1.37 in terms of benefits. Those are benefits in terms of savings for families, obviously vitally important now in the context of the cost of living crisis, but also health benefits for children, and importantly educational benefits, because it helps with absenteeism, it helps with educational attainment, and then through to lifetime earnings. And that's before you count the wider economic benefits of the school food supply chains, if you like, and the jobs and so forth, which can be captured through higher levels of public procurement of food. So I think the onus really is now with the DfE and Treasury to look at this evidence and make the right decision. Again, this is something which could be acted upon very quickly. There's a big national campaign called Feed the Future, which we're helping to coordinate, bringing together a whole range of different organisations in support of extending free school meals to all households with children in receipt of universal credit, as a first step towards actually making free school meals universally available for children in school, and not means testing children on what they eat in school.
Thank you. And yesterday, as you know, I launched a report into childhood hunger in London, and I make a very clear recommendation about the free school meal, universal free school meal provision, extending at some point to secondary school children as well. I wondered what your opinion on that would be.
Absolutely, wholeheartedly support that. I mean, our teenagers, when you look across the whole population, our teenagers are the group of the demographic, if you like, which are eating worst in terms of the healthiness of their diets. They're young, you know, they're often more in control of what they're eating, and they're subject to a lot of advertising and the damaging food environments in which they're making decisions about what they eat. And so making sure that school is a place where they can get a really nutritious meal. It's freely available. They can sit down together with their friends and enjoy the sociability of eating together, as well as the nutrition that it brings and the impact that it will have on their learning. So wholeheartedly, fantastic actually to see some London boroughs really exploring that and trialling out some expansion to secondary school children.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Chair. My apologies again for jumping around.
That's fine. Thank you so much, Anna. I know that you may have to leave a little bit early, so really are grateful for all of your contributions. Sharron, we're going to come to you now. You've heard quite a lot about what everyone's thoughts are about food banks and why this is happening. But, you know, at the end of the day, we really need to hear from you. And you've listened to what everyone's been saying. I just want to hear from your heart. How do you feel about what people have been saying here today, and And what do you want us to leave thinking about before you do end this session? And you're very welcome to join us in the gallery, because I know that you're going to be leaving us shortly, but we do want to hear from you.
Okay. Basically, I agree with everything that's been said today. And if I could just add to what I see personally in terms of working with young people and people where I work locally. So the HAF programme, we have that in the borough where I live. So in the half term and throughout the whole of the youth service within the area that I live, we feed young people every day. So whatever session is running, young people get fed. So we'd like to be able to do that more often. School meals, definitely. I know of working families that can't afford to put money on their children's card for them to go to school to eat, and then what the schools are now taking up the slack, so they will pay for that child to enable them to eat, so that needs to be addressed. I'm going to just go back to universal credit. We need it to be reformed. It needs to be a safety net, what it was designed for originally. If we go back to the original purpose of having that, it was to help people that are down, unemployed, disabled, can't work, but give them enough to live on. You know, it's so hard not being able to have those basic necessities. And I'm just talking about me as a single person. I'm not even talking about that family, that person that's a single parent, that person that's got loads of children that are on their own. I just can only imagine how hard it is for them. I just want change, just please. You know, with the high cost of living, fuel prices, to me it feels like we're being squeezed on all corners, and there's no let up. It's intense, it's persistent, and it's squeezing. And I'm just talking about myself, and I can imagine it must be different for other people, but we're all being squeezed, and I don't know, there isn't enough left to go round, if that makes sense. You know, cost of inflation is worrying, rents are going up, that's worrying, food is going up, everything is going up, and it's just really, really worrying. I work, so I'm not worried, but I have 4 or 5 jobs. And that's what I do to survive. But I'm in the fortunate position because I have got a good job and I'm working, but others are not. And it's for them that we need to change for, the less well off, those that can't work, those that want to but can't.
Thank you, Sharron. We're definitely going to be leaving this meeting thinking about your words, and we really do appreciate your time today for coming in. I'm going to bang this gavel now so allow you a little bit of time to get your things, and we'll start again in a couple of minutes. And we're back. Thank you so much. We're going to be moving now on to the next subject, which is food banks. We've already been talking quite a lot about this at length. So Assembly Member Bailey's just going to ask some additional questions on that. Thank you.
Good morning to all of our guests. I'm going to address my first comments to Heather and Sabine, and if I'll give the question and you can come back with comments. We'll try not to retrace ground that we've already been over. So I'm going to try and ask quite specific questions. Are London's food banks providing food which meets London's diverse population's needs? I did some work with the Felix project, and we had huge volumes of food, but a personal note was lots of it was the same food sometimes, and I wondered if we were able to give people the nutrition they need through food banks, and also that cultural need, because of course in London we have a vast number of cultures. So has your experience been, Sabine, that that's been provided for?
So what I'd say on that is that as we're seeing food banks struggle to support people at all, then of course that's the range and diversity that they're able to give people is being immediately reduced. So this is providing food through food banks is not a sustainable or acceptable or desirable solution. What we need is for people to be able to afford to buy food for themselves and meet their dietary needs and buy the food that's culturally appropriate for themselves. So, trying to build a better infrastructure around food banks or improving the access to diverse food or the food that meets people's dietary requirements is not the way we should be approaching this. We support our food banks in providing guidance on nutritional guidelines and helping them in trying to source the right food and thinking about culturally appropriate food. But at the moment, they're needing to make do with whatever they are donated, whatever is donated to them, and with the rapidly reduced resources that they have to spend on food. So, we need to think about what this moment is proving in terms of unsustainability and take direct action with a cash-first approach.
I suspect you're right, because it is an emergency in people. Because I watch the supermarkets be very generous, but they could only give what they had as far as they could see. Heather, if I just take in a slightly different direction, the Trussell Trust report has a scale of knowing food insecurity right up to full food insecurity. Are people anywhere on this scale being supported to the same level? Are people coming in and saying, I have a little need or I have a huge need? How they differentiated between?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's an important question. And Anna alluded to this earlier, I think. So in terms of people that we're seeing at our food banks, they are people at quite the extreme end of the food insecurity spectrum. So we've got, as I've said, 97% of people using our food banks in London meet the criteria for destitution, which means that they lack the income to afford essentials, including food, accommodation and so on. So yes, when we're talking about food bank use, it really is that more extreme end of the spectrum, and obviously the problem extends far beyond that as well.
Okay, thank you. Pam, I know I did say I was going to speak to Sabine and Heather, but it's just dawned on me. I did a lot of youth work for a long time. I come from a community work background, and we often talked about the food young people were eating, and everybody ran cooking courses for young people. But we spoke to parents. Do you think there is a piece of work that needs to be done around how people use the food they get and understanding how far they can make that food go or not?
I absolutely think you need to back the winners there, and there are some real winners, but it's not normal. Mm-hmm. And it falls off the end of the pier when the funding stops.
Okay.
So I absolutely agree that we could help people a lot by thinking through their particular needs and the skill sets required, whether that's through the schools, whether that's through the doctor's surgery. We've a lot of assets out there that could be thinking about how people can turn what they can get their hands on locally into good, cheap, nutritious meals, and we're not sweating that. So yes, we could do a lot more.
Okay, thank you. Heather, if I come back to you, your own report draws a completely different conclusion to the GLA's report around who is attending food banks and why. I'm talking particularly around single parent them. I come from a single parent family and watched my mum struggle for years, and I have sisters and stuff who are in the same situation. But the report seemed to draw a different conclusion around who is using food banks, and I suppose then why.
Sorry. Thank you. I think I would need to look more closely at the data, but a possible reason might be because we are seeing at that, in terms of who's accessing food banks, which is what our data is really about, we do see much greater representation of single-person households and single-parent households too. And I think that may be, it may be to do with a difference in rates of destitution versus rates of food insecurity. I would need to look into that a bit further, but I think it may be to do with patterns, reasons why people turn to food banks, for example, rather than other forms of support that they might need. They might kind of draw upon if they found themselves in the position of not being able to afford food.
I think that would be a very welcome piece of analysis, so we can get real accuracy around who needs the support, where they are or are not getting that support, and how we could speak into that conversation. That'd be very useful. Just to move on to the next question, let maybe start with you, Sabine. What is the long-term future of food banks? Should we be aiming for a situation where we no longer need food banks to exist? I suppose that statement answers itself, but how do we get there, I suppose, is the answer.
Would you mind if I just mention something on the previous question?
Absolutely, absolutely.
When you're needing a food bank, you may not be getting a referral. So the Trussell Trust uses a referral system, but many independents will support people without a referral. So often you see there's a different demographic. We don't have the data, unfortunately, from the independent sector to back up all of this. But it's really important to remember that there is a difference in data around the fact that agency referrals are needed, and so we are in independent food banks will tend to see people who are in work more often, tend to see people who have no recourse to public funds because they may not have the usual routes via agencies to access the Trussell Trust food bank. And on to your question, I mean, absolutely, we need to aim for a society without the need for food banks and a society without the need for any form of charitable food aid. I would refer you to the work of the Scottish Government, who have actually drafted a plan to end the need for food banks. It's in draft form, and there is a plan that should be published soon with that in mind. And it's laid out and it's there, and many of us have responded and are building that case together with the Scottish Government around addressing the root causes of the poverty driving food bank use and wider food insecurity through building a social security system that's fit for purpose and ensuring, by whichever way one can, that wages match the cost of living and there's job security so that people's incomes mean they don't need charitable food aid.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We are...
Oh, sorry, Chair's question 10. I didn't quite see that. Excuse me.
I was going to ask that question.
In my defence, it's on the other page. Is there any actions the Mayor could take to support food bank users in London? We're aware of the scale at which the Mayor can operate. Of course, he can't operate the same scale as the government. But is there anything that the Mayor could be doing more of to support food bank users in London? Yes, I'll start with Sabine and go to Heather and anybody else.
Well, I mean, the Mayor has done some excellent work in the direction of a cash-first approach, but there's more that needs to be done. And I don't want to repeat myself, but the focus on advice services and ensuring that there are more and more advisors available, recruiting people to train people to be advisors, ensuring that everyone's on the same page across local authorities around the importance of a cash grant being available as a first port of call. When someone's facing money worries or financial crisis, they need to be able to, first of all, find the advice to maximise their income, but they also need to know and be able to easily access a cash grant, a crisis grant at local authority level. And it's really important that we build on existing work around a real living wage and that employers, collaboratively in partnership with other local organisations, put that at the forefront of their approach to poverty and inequality in their areas. A cash-first approach means putting income at the heart of a response to growing food bank use and food insecurity, but also ensuring that people know where to go, ensuring that people know where to seek out advice, and advertising that and promoting that as much as possible. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Heather, contribution?
Yes, so I would absolutely affirm what Sabine has said. Excuse me. And when we speak to our food banks in London about this question, the message that we're really hearing very clearly from them is that they what they really want is for the Mayor's emphasis to be on those cash-first approaches to local welfare and local support and advocacy around the UK social security system as well, because that's what they believe is really going to make the most difference for the people that they are seeing and the people that they're concerned are going to need their help in the future.
Thank you. Chair, back to you.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member Bailey. I'm just going to drop in a quick question. Everyone's been talking quite a lot about cash grants, and that's been a theme that I've been picking up on. What's your opinion on universal basic income as being a solution?
So from a Trussell Trust perspective, our focus is really on more targeted interventions than universal basic income. So really making sure that those on the lowest incomes have enough income to afford the essentials. So that would be our position on that at the moment.
Happy for any other comments?
I think a robust discussion around universal basic income would be very welcome at this point, but it all ties in with a cash-first approach, and we just need to focus on not building up further infrastructure around a charitable food aid system as a first priority.
Thank you very much for answering that quick question. Now we're moving on to local food growing to Assembly Member Polanski, and then Assembly Member Hirani will be finishing off that section.
Thank you, Chair. Pam, in a moment I want to talk about urban food growing, but I just want to pick up on with you, Sabine, on the conversation about food banks. On Monday, I was presenting a short piece for Channel 4 around the fact that our cost of living crisis is really an income crisis and inequality crisis. So I went to visit some independent food banks and spoke to staff there. And there was some particular concerns they had, and I just wanted to know if that is a trend. So one concern they had was the rise in people visiting recently for more of a warm bank. And they were actually saying people were coming to a food bank and wanting to really stay there for a while and have tea and biscuits. And while people were very welcome, and that creates a good sense of community, it's also it's exacerbating the pressure that there already is on the food bank. And then the second thing, if I can just put both to you, is a kind of issue of technological justice. So they're looking at, rather than people coming and picking up a food parcel and not having any choice what's in that food parcel, putting money onto people's phones so they can go to the supermarket themselves or the local food market and then buy food that matches their requirements. And that's got obvious benefits if you eat halal or kosher food or whatever your dietary requirements might be. Just to see if these are general trends going across the board.
So in answer to your first question, I have heard that anecdotally, but I would expect that to happen more and more, that people will be needing to use the spaces to help keep themselves warm. And when it comes to warm spaces, warm banks, I mean, we're having the conversations are happening now in the same way as they were happening around food banks several years ago, and we need to really be wary of the fact that we don't want to be talking about ending the need for warm banks or warm spaces in 5 years' time, because it's an identical situation, isn't it? You know, food banks set up 10, 12 years ago were planning on doing it for a year or 2 years. They weren't imagining that they would be part of an infrastructure in 2022. And in answer to your second question, we promote that actually amongst our members, the use of shopping vouchers or shopping cards instead or alongside food parcels. We put together a briefing, and in fact that's part of the work of the Scottish Government in terms of the plan to end the need for food banks. And many of our members actually do distribute vouchers and shopping cards to people to allow them more choice and dignity around the food that they eat. But they are struggling with that now because their resources are dwindling, and so they're now having to go back a step and make do with donations and perhaps not be in a position to enable that kind of choice for the people that they're supporting.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Pam, we often say that there's no environmental justice without social justice too, and I think urban food growing is a really tangible example of that. Could you tell us what role you see local food growing having in tackling food insecurity?
Thank you. I think it's a very important piece of that jigsaw that I referred to. I always want to put what I have to say in the perspective that there's not E equals MC squared on this one. It's complex, it's many-faceted, it's systemic. But what I do think is that in times of real crisis that we have now and the increased crisis that we'll have in the future, the means of empowering people to find localised solutions, reconnect with their communities, the dignity you spoke of, the upskilling, the sharing of knowledge, that sense of being a solution, not a victim, is incredibly important when we're trying to build a society that is worthy of the next generation, just to be, trite about it, I suppose, in a way. So, from my point of view, Incredible Edible was set up in order to demonstrate, as I've said, that people actually, given the opportunity, could be very significant players in how their own neighbours, streets, families were nurtured. Which is why the premise of growing, sharing skills and spending money locally has had resonance across the globe. And we are a bunch of volunteers. So I haven't got a statistician sat in a cupboard somewhere. But I've got a lot of people that are supporting us, pro bono and the like. We have 150 groups in the UK, and we've got people all over the planet waking up and starting to see that actually there is land that surrounds them on which they could nurture their children, and it's about time they rolled up their sleeves and did something about it. My perspective is that when people start to do that, you start to play into that wider environment that Anna was speaking about, that sense of positivity, not negativity that drags you down. You start to improve the environmental enhancement of the area as well, so you bring smiles to people's faces. You have them walking through edible landscapes, so they understand seasonality, they understand biodiversity, they feel uplifted by the sounds of the birds, they can see the apples on the trees, they start to understand how Brussels sprouts grow, or whatever. Of course, planning is key to make that happen. But food growing as a means of reconnecting people to their own future and the future of their planet is absolutely fundamental, and it is the easiest point of access. Talking to them about peak oil doesn't get a long way in the pub. But when you actually talk about food with people, then you start to bring across cultures, across age, across income and across ability, a universal conversation that is what empowers and really, I think, drives our more sustainable, resilient communities. Which is why I mention, on top of seeking out new ways of doing things, can we rethink what we've already got in terms of our assets? We have a tremendous amount of land funded through public taxation in a time of food crisis. That cannot be just. We need to rethink the purpose of that food, of that land that is funded through public taxation. And we need to allow people, as a turnkey project, to have a right to access it to grow food on, full stop. Whether that's local authorities, whether that's health authorities, whether that's Ministry of Justice, or whatever it is. It's turnkey, because it's not a universal solution, but through that, we start to find people who can find more localised solutions and networks, who can create cooperatives, who can start to think collectively as citizens about their role in nurturing their future and their communities. So it's turnkey, it's the beginning of a new conversation, but from it, all manner of benefits that we've been talking about in terms of health, in terms of skills, in terms of economy, starts to flow. And I think if we don't do that pretty quick, then in 10 years' time we'll look back and think we missed a real trick there.
I think you put that really powerfully. Now, the last time we spoke, we were supporting the launch of a handbook called Growing for Change. And actually, there was a marriage proposal in the audience while we were talking. Hopefully that won't happen today. But joking aside, you spoke that day about right to roam, and I think that's part of what you're alluding to now. Is that something you'd want to elaborate further in this context?
Yeah, I did lead on right to roam, but that was a long time ago, so it's right to grow now.
Sorry, right to grow.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. Yeah, it's just the experience that one of the obstacles to more people being involved in finding solutions for their own food, and this is not universal, we have many different people in our communities with many different needs, but there's a heck of a lot of people who could gain real benefit if they could have easy access to the land that at the moment is stewarded by public bodies. So that conversation needs to open up. I'm absolutely clear. We've got a piece of legislation drawn up by barristers. We launched it in the House of Lords in April. It's ready to go into any levelling up legislation or rights legislation or whatever you want. We're hoping that someone would do that through the Lords initially, but times they are difficult at the moment, so who knows what's happening. But we've also got motions to combined authorities, and we've got motions to local authorities, where they themselves can not rely on the goodwill of good officers or the benevolence of good assembly members, but actually have a right to open up that conversation about, well, I'll do the growing if you'll cover my insurance or whatever else it might be. It's ready to go if there was a will to do it. 15 years of experience says you can trust the people to be part of the solution if you work with them to remove the obstacles to helping them live more fulfilling, respected lives. So yeah, it's ready to go. And the wonderful thing is, if I might say, you've got so many advocates out there already doing it. You know, your capital growth, your good to grow, the sustained network, the transition town. There's lots and lots and lots of people, plus your local authorities. Spoke to Hackney, spoke to Southwark, spoke to Lambeth. They're all funding individuals, far too few, who are helping their communities nurture themselves by growing or by cooking. But they're about to have the plug pulled because they've not got enough money. If you started to look at it in a different way, through a rights basis, you might start to see in different investment programmes in terms of the skill sets needed at a grassroots level, and then you might really start to put some wind under the wings of communities themselves. And I think that is part of a solution.
And just to dig into that even further, do you have any specific examples of food growing initiatives, particularly in London, and what kind of impact these have had?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you just take the many sites that are capital growth, or you take the network of networks in Lambeth, you have got people who will give you, and we've produced a book actually, called Seeds to Solutions, which is where ordinary folks across the country, but Lambeth is given as an example, who didn't really see that this growing thing was going to do anything other than get soil under their fingernails until they started to have the crack with their next door neighbour, until they started to produce the food and started to understand what soil was all about, until they started to cook with their children and the like. There are many examples. I would say Hackney and Lambeth are particularly good, but they're all over the place. You know, you would fall over them if you started to have that conversation in any borough. So there are loads of examples. There is no lack of proof of concept. The lack is the will to make the change.
Powerfully put. And then my very final question is, Debbie, as Deputy Mayor, articulated powerfully earlier the disproportionate nature of this, particularly on black and minority ethnic communities, and also the disabled community. What opportunity is, so you just talked here about literally getting their hands in the soil. What difference does that make to communities, whether they're from ethnic minority communities or any community, the difference it makes to be in that community and put your hands in the soil?
I can give you an example from Incredible Edible. So we kicked off something called propaganda gardening because we didn't like guerrilla gardening because it sounded too full of testosterone, basically. But basically, it's take a plot that's unloved and grow food on it. Stick some signs up there, share the food, start the conversation. What happens in propaganda gardening and what happens across the piece in all your capital growth areas and beyond is that it's a very visible display and a very low point of entry for people who lack confidence or skills or even connections in their community. It's in a very public place. They walk their kids to school there, or they go to the doctors there, or they nip to the shop there, or whatever it might be. It has a huge impact on not only the worth of the individual who might be trying to find ways of connecting with their community but don't know quite how to do it. Well, actually racking up and growing some beans and sharing it. You know, we've got some brilliant examples of mums who hardly spoke any English at all who are doing this, both in school playgrounds and outside the playgrounds, and suddenly they start to see that there are mums from all over the place and they start to have a different sense of self-worth. But it's not only that. It's about opening up the eyes of everybody to see the shared humanity, irrespective of cultural background. And I think that's really important because that starts to take down any barriers of uncertainty around, can I have a conversation? Will I make a fool of myself? Am I going, no. Start to talk about food, start to grow in very public places, and you will start to see that breakdown of that lack of understanding across our communities. It's the best example I can think of, and 15 years has kind of proved it to me.
You almost make it sound really obvious. Thank you very much, Pam. Thank you, Chair.
I love your passion, Pam. Off to Assembly Member Harani now.
Thank you, Chair, and a question to Pam as well. So how could the Mayor support local food growing projects in order to help address food insecurity?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that.
Yeah.
Again, I start by saying I do, you know, with humility, I don't know all the details of how you do things here, but I'm stopping with a friend of mine who happened to wave in front of my eye your national park map for Greater London, where you've mapped all your green spaces, all your food spaces, all there is. So, you know, one of the points of the right to grow piece of legislation is, the first point is, create with your community a map of where they can grow, of where you, Warhurst, control yourself, of where there are green spaces on which food can be grown. Just do it. Well, you've already done it. So you don't even have to think about that. And lots of other places have already done it, because for planning needs, there is a need to do that. So the mayor could quite easily, I believe, look at that and find the appropriate, first of all, read the legislation and understand how that could be interpreted in terms of mayoral responsibilities and duties, and then pass the motion that would encourage more boroughs across Greater London to actually adopt this as normal. And the reason I think the mayor could lead so positively is, if I might refer to what you mentioned earlier, which is right to roam. Forgive me for cross-referencing something completely different, but I ended up leading that nationally. And I had Ramblers here, and I had Moorland Association there, and I had people who hated each other, basically, all round the table. But the point was, the leadership came from Michael Meacher. The leadership came to say, we're going to do this, so crack on with it. And we had the most amazingly wonderful and positive discussions about how to make it happen, not if it should happen. And I think that's the real role of the Mayor of London.
Thank you. Just on that, so obviously in the absence of the legislation that you're working to have implemented by government, so in terms of individuals in London, actually across the country, how would you address some of the costs or barriers associated with food growing, such as land, if you're looking at individual households, lack of garden space, lack of balcony space? How would you sort of suggest that we tackle some of those issues on a day-to-day basis?
I'd start from what you've got, not what you've not got. And what you've got is a lot. Yeah. You've got a lot of unloved land. You've got a lot of land that local authorities are finding very difficult to maintain now. You've got an ever-decreasing sense of positivity in some of your local authorities, because they want to do these things with the land that they actually have, but they can't afford to do that anymore. So from my point of view, if you start from looking at where your assets are, once you start to open your eyes to that, you see them everywhere. And then you start to have a conversation about, so how are we going to do this? Okay, I've got a maintenance budget. Can I do anything with that? I've got a health budget. Can I do anything with that? I've got a youth engagement budget. Can I do anything with that? So you start to cut the cake slightly differently. Now, and I'm not being naive, but because there's this a holistic conversation that we're having about how you make these things happen, then you start to draw in, and actually there are savings on the one part, and there are reinvestment opportunities on the other. So it's a terribly difficult time to have this conversation when we don't quite know what's going to happen on the 31st of October, et al. But there nevertheless are assets there, and there is experience there, and there are people in those communities who could be called upon to support. And beyond that, not only in terms of the Greater London Authority, but in terms of the health authorities that there are, and others. There is a collective out there that could repurpose the realm it stewards and rethink its investments in how to make sure that you optimise the effectiveness for the citizens of London and enable them to nurture themselves. It's difficult, but it is not impossible, but it is impossible if you don't start the conversation.
Thank you, Pam. And first of all, I'm going to thank Debbie Weeks-Brown for the visit to my constituency to on this very topic, to a food growing project stroke food bank with London Community Kitchen. But just listening to what Pam has suggested about how the mayor can influence or change things in London, do you have any immediate response to that on food growing?
So aside from saying that Pam is a force of nature, and it's been really wonderful listening to her, I think so. There are a couple of things. The first is that Pam has said some really important. She's raised some important points around bringing different communities together and promoting integration, which is actually definitely something that the mayor is very, very keen on, and that is incredibly important. So thank you for those suggestions. But I think the second thing to sort of mention is that, and I think we might have mentioned it when we all first sat down, if we're looking at ways of tackling insecurity, food insecurity in particular, these are all part of a sort of a big jigsaw, and it's incredibly necessary for us, I think, given the urgency and the immediacy of the current crisis, to really focus our attention on ways of raising individuals' incomes and getting them through the winter. So Pam's suggestions are brilliant. They're good for the long-term health of our community. They're good for bringing communities together. They're good for generating some of those skills that not everyone has. And I think, I think that that's really important. We do need to note that. I have to say my focus is, unfortunately, on how we get through to next April, and how we think about the ways in which we try to support those on the very lowest incomes who were already struggling before this cost of living crisis hit. And that on looking at food insecurity, we think about community food growing, yes. We think about the importance and the sustainability of our food banks, yes. But ultimately, we think about that cash-first approach, which will enable individuals to have the money in their pockets effectively to see them through the next 6 months or so. So I think that's my kind of my doom and gloom response, but it's kind of the reason that that I guess we're all here, and it's really important to make it.
Thank you so much, Pam. If we don't get the things that you want, I can imagine you outside with a placard or something, like food is a right or something like that, and I'll be there with you as well. So thank you so much for all your passion. And you're absolutely right, Debbie's right, you are an inspiration, as are all our guests who've been speaking today. We're going to be moving on to the final section, which is going to be focused now on the mayoral initiatives to address food insecurity. We'll be starting off with Assembly Member Bailey, just for a first couple of questions, and then to Assembly Member Ahmed, and then to Assembly Member Garrett to end. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Hello again to the panel. This question's for Debbie. Hello, Debbie. What has the impact of Kitchen Social Scheme been on tackling food insecurity, and is the Mayor continuing to fund the scheme?
Thanks. That's a good question. So Kitchen Social, for those of you who don't know, is a project that's run by the Mayor's Fund for London. It's something that the Mayor has funded for the past 5 years or so, and it's a really important way of providing a lot of those skills, solutions that was mentioned by Anna before when she was talking about the HAF programme. So it gives young people something meaningful to do during the school holidays. They provide activities, they do cooking skills, they tackle some of the isolation which is often felt by children and young people who come from low-income families, given that cost is something which can be a barrier to them getting out and really enjoying themselves in the holidays. And ultimately also it gives them a hot meal. And so Kitchen Social, whilst it's been up and running, has managed to have a positive impact on around 78,000 young people, children and young people. And it's worked across 28 of London's boroughs. It's run around 9,000 sessions in total. And in an evaluation that that Kitchen Social has conducted, or that the Mayor's Fund for London conducted about Kitchen Social, young people who participated in the project said how much it enabled them to make good friends. The parents were really positive about the fact that their children had somewhere safe to go, their children had somewhere where they'd get a good meal, but also that they were able to make friends and build social networks. So, as I mentioned, we have funded it for 5 years. We funded it last year. We spent around 334,000 altogether. We're not funding it currently. The Kitchen Social programme has been hugely beneficial in, I suppose, persuading government to fund the holiday and activities and food programme. And that programme is now funded by government and is funded by local authorities. And in respect of that, and because of that funding and because of that support, the work of Kitchen Social, or the work that Kitchen Social was able to do, has become folded into that work. And so they've done a really good job last year, when we funded them the last time, of helping local authorities to sort of stand up immediately to the ask from government to run the HAF programme, which they did and has been done very successfully for many local authorities. So whilst we're not funding them currently, we are talking to them importantly about the fact that obviously the only children and young people who are able to benefit from a HAF scheme are those who are eligible for free school meals. And I think we've heard from everybody already this morning that that eligibility misses a huge number of children who are living in homes where their parents are claiming universal credit, and these will often be individuals who are in work but are also in poverty. And so I think one of the issues that the Mayor's Fund for London and Kitchen Social are keen to address, and we are keen to continue speaking with them about this, is ensuring that the benefits of HAF can be extended to all of those other children who are not currently
So are you
benefiting.
suggesting that you're going to continue the funding or provide some funding to broaden the offer?
No, I'm saying what we're doing is we're having a conversation with them about what they want to do.
But if
to
that's the
ensure,
outcome...
To ensure, can you let me finish? So we are having a conversation with them to find out what they still need to do to ensure that they can start to reach those other children who are not currently supported under HAF. So we're having those conversations.
But would you provide them with funds? Because surely that's going to be one of the outcomes.
I wouldn't want to say at this point until we've had those conversations.
But I'd be surprised if they said, well, we can do more, but it's going to be for free.
I'm sure that they could say all sorts of things, but we are having positive conversations with them, and I think that's the best thing that we can say. I wouldn't want to say, yes, we're funding them, or no, we're not funding them, when we haven't had those conversations.
I'm sure the chair and the rest of the committee would be very interested in the outcomes of those conversations. Look, the London Food Strategy Implementation Plan committed to providing 300,000 meals for 50,000 children and young people by 2020 as part of the Kitchen Social Scheme. However, only just over 19,000 meals were provided as part of the scheme by 2021. Can you explain why the target was missed by such a significant margin?
Are you talking about Kitchen Social here?
Yeah, but it comes out of the London Food Implementation Plan. But yes, Kitchen Social.
So I think probably the best way to answer that is that Kitchen Social was obviously running its own programme up until the HAF scheme itself started. Now that the HAF scheme has started, and that is the principal way in which that kind of provision is being provided now to children across the city, that is the main way in which children are now receiving hot meals and activities funded by the government and rolled out by local authorities. So Kitchen Social themselves are seeking to find their own role in that broader landscape of work. So if there is, they did an awfully good job up until that point. Obviously, that's now been taken over by London boroughs, and they are doing themselves an incredible job themselves to continue to fund, to support children and young people. And Kitchen Social and the Mayor's Fund for London are seeking to work out what their role will be now in that broader landscape.
Thank you for that, but I'm trying to focus on why they missed the target by such a wide margin, and because that will play into the conversations you're having with them now. Because if they miss that target, you're having conversations where you could potentially fund them. Surely you'll need to understand what happened there.
Well, I would, without having the conversation with them, I would put that down to the fact that they were running a programme up until a certain period of time. That programme has now been taken on by others who are doing an incredibly good job. And so obviously they then now need to see what they can do to support those other children that I mentioned, but also to work out what their role will now be in the provision of activities and providing hot food for children and young people, in addition to what London boroughs are doing.
Okay, but I still feel like some understanding needs to be gained there, so you can just work on the effectiveness of them, particularly if you're going to give them more money. Again, you haven't said you are, but I bet they ask for some. The other thing I think needs looking at, they provided 40,000 meals to children in 4 boroughs, and then 29,000 meals to the whole rest of London. Why such a focus in those boroughs and not an even distribution of the provision? I mean, look, Lambeth, Southwark and Tower Hamlets and Camden seem to get the lion's share of all that activity. Why?
I mean, I think the only thing that I can say in answer to that is that they are now working in 28 boroughs. Well, they were working in 28 boroughs previously, up until the HAF programme started. And I think one of the key things about what Kitchen Social does, which I think is important for us to remember, is that they deliver these activities through community organisations and youth-led partnerships. So they identify community organisations, youth workers, those who can do this work for them on a local basis. So it's actually incredibly important for them to ensure that they are working with local groups. It may well be, and you would need to bring, obviously, Mayor's Fund for London to provide the more detailed answer to that question, but it may well be that it has taken that time to be able to build up all of the networks that are necessary to be able to deliver that activity through those community organisations on that local level. It may well be that for the four also boroughs that you mentioned, that they had very good networks in those places, and it took them time to develop the partnerships and the networks in the other 24. I don't know, but I'll have to be completely honest with you, Sean, for the detail on the nature of those partnerships and how they developed, you'd need to speak to their new CEO.
But shouldn't they be providing you with those details, because you're the person having conversations with them about how you may support them into the future?
So we have always funded them in relation to a specific issue that they need support with. So, for example, during the pandemic, when they came to us for funding, we were funding them to try to deliver small boxes to children and families because everything was locked down. And that was a very specific and unusual request that they gave us at that time. Last year, we funded them to help local authorities to stand up their response to the HAF programme. So they do come to us for very specific requests. So I wouldn't be having a conversation about how they run the entirety of their programme. They come to us with very specific requests, and we are always happy
So when they come with those requests, did they name these boroughs as the reason I'm going down this line of questioning? The mayor is meant to be a mayor for all of London, sure. And if a organisation comes with a request, certainly the first question that should be asked is who, where, how in London. You know, who in London will benefit from this? Because if you live in outer London, in a place say like Harold Hill, very very poor part of London, right out there in Havering, you worry that you're ignored because all the focus is in central London. And obviously for the mayor and yourself to overcome this, simply asking where they're going to be operating would be a very powerful question, surely.
Well, absolutely, but they are, and to my knowledge, the last time that they were operating across 28 boroughs, which, I mean, I know it's not all of them, but that's a significant reach, and they are working, importantly, in those parts of London which have very high levels of multiple deprivation. So the places where they are operating are definitely meeting those with the greatest need. I think the additional issue that we need to get over at this particular moment in time, and the conversations that we're having, is that there are other individuals who are not being covered by HAF, and those are the individuals for whom some additional support is necessary. And so the conversations that I will be having with them will be ostensibly about some of that, as well as the extension of provision across the whole of the 13 weeks of the school holidays, because at the moment it's only offered for 6. So there are a range of different gaps, I suppose, in current provision that we should be having conversations with them about. But in relation to your question, I am confident that the places in which they were delivering initially before HAF were those areas where need was greatest. And that, for me, I think is the important issue.
I think you're correct in one respect. I see that they're operating in places that need the support, but there's other places in London that are regularly ignored that also need the support. So I'm making a plea on mainly outer boroughs to say, look, there is deprivation, there's serious deprivation, and can they always be part of the conversation? I think that's the point I'm heading at. But let me move you on before the chair says something to me. What has the impact of the Mayor's Food Routes Incubator programme been on tackling food insecurity, and how is its impact being measured?
So the Food Routes programme is something we're incredibly proud of. It's a programme which supports food aid organisations in 10 boroughs in London. And what it has done is it has strengthened some of those partnerships which were developed during the pandemic between food aid organisations, local authorities, and some elements of the private sector. We started running it last year, it finished in August, and we have plans to start another iteration imminently. So the impact of the 10 partnerships has been, and the way in which we've measured it has been qualitative in nature rather than quantitative, and there's a reason for that. Because the partnerships which were set up and established during the pandemic were very diverse in nature, so there were partnerships, some of which, reflecting on some of the work that Pam's doing, which were focused on community growing. Some were focused on retail and trying to think of ways in which to find alternative ways of getting different types of food. Others were focused on the cash-first approach that we've been talking about an awful lot today. And because they were so very different in their nature, and rightly so because they started in the pandemic, it was very difficult to identify unit measures to sort of measure the impact, so quantitative units. So we've measured the impact qualitatively, and some of the good things that have come from the first iteration are that some of those partnerships felt able to speak to individuals who were coming into food banks seeking food about benefit uptake. And they felt confident enough to talk to them about income maximisation, which is clearly one of the things that we really want to be focusing on. Others said to us that actually what is helpful or would have been more helpful is for their partnerships to be wider. Because whilst they were able to do a lot of good signposting to other projects and partnerships in a local area, if that partnership were bigger, they could signpost to more people or to more organisations. So we've taken some of that learning, and what we have decided to focus on in the second iteration of Food Routes is to make it more focused on that cash-first approach, and to enable us to be able to understand more specifically how many people have benefited from being recommended more benefits that they might be entitled to, how many people were told that they should take up Healthy Start vouchers, for example, if they're eligible, and be able to quantify that, but then also, importantly, be able to quantify how much people were saving as well. So how much of their income were they able to either retain or to gain from the information that they got from the programme. And also, because I think ostensibly the partnerships or the project was about trying to build in sustainability into the food aid sector, because as I think everyone has said here today, we don't want the food aid sector to become a permanent part of the welfare system. So if we can encourage and help and train and support those who volunteer and work for the food aid partnerships, to be able to do that signposting, to be able to give that advice, then that would have a much more beneficial impact on those who come to food banks in the first place for support, because they're coming, they're getting what they've initially come for, obviously, which is a food parcel, but also they are leaving with better advice, a better knowledge about what they're entitled to, and hopefully a better sense as to how they can improve their incomes. And that will, I suppose, in a way, help towards that question that you asked, Sabine, earlier about, the getting rid of food banks aim, which is ultimately what we're keen to do. So we've taken what we've learned from that first iteration. The second iteration will be focused more on the cash-first approach. We will use that to develop better quantitative measures so that we could come back, if you wanted to ask us to come back, to ask us what the impact of it has been in the second iteration.
I think to quantity. Look, as someone who's done youth and community work for 30 odd years now, I understand that sometimes it can be hard to quantify the good that's being done, but from this side of the table it's be very important for those to be developed, because it just makes it that much easier for us to lean in and help and that kind of thing. But you do sound like you're leaning in the right direction, I do have to say. Can you just do one thing for me though, and elaborate on how the
Assemblymember Bailey, can Sabine come in quite
excuse me, Sabine.
Would that be okay? So just really briefly, we've been working across London boroughs with partnerships, just like the Deputy Mayor's mentioned, to co-produce what we call cash first referral leaflets, worrying about money leaflets, and we've put together leaflets in 14 areas and working in another 5 at the moment. And I just to reflect on, trying to measure the impacts of that work, and what we'd always advocate for is food insecurity measurement at local authority level. So it's really important that, we don't look at food, you can't be looking at food bank data, can't be looking at numbers of people accessing advice services, because sometimes people can't get through as well, we know. We need to be looking directly at the levels of food insecurity and link that up to, the wider food insecurity measurement that is underway already, and with the DWP Family Resources Survey.
I mean, that sounds like a good recommendation to me, Chair. We'll look at that in our report for sure. I'm sure. Thank you for that. Just to quickly go back to Deputy Mayor, can you clarify for me? What did you say? 10 councils or 10 boroughs? Why those 10? What was the rationale behind selecting those 10?
So these were all places where partnerships were already existing. So we wanted to use food routes to try to ensure that some of them were already existing. Those partnerships which had developed during the pandemic were able to continue because they were having such a positive impact on those who were accessing them. And it was really important, I think, and Sabine would probably agree, it was really important during the pandemic that the food aid sector was able to have really good, strong links with their local authorities, because they have that local knowledge, and also they can provide that immediate support for the food aid sector, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, when we had all of those issues with the lack of donations, when food banks didn't have enough food to distribute to those people who were isolating due to COVID and due to being clinically vulnerable. So those were the areas that were selected.
Can I just sort of cut in on you, Deputy Mayor, just to give you another thing to quickly consider before I come to end? Which boroughs were most successful and why? Because you've said that some partnerships already existed, so that would suggest you had to select people who didn't have partnerships. Were they more successful? Were the existing partnerships more successful? Is there any pattern to success, or was it just what happened locally?
There's no pattern to success because they were also very different and they were doing so many different things. As I mentioned before, it's very difficult to quantify what that success looked like. The areas that we have selected are areas where there are good, strong relationships already between local authorities and their food aid sector. So it was important for us to really enable them to do that work well. When we come to looking at the new iteration, we will look again at the 10, and we'll look again at who it is that we choose to do this work in, because I think one of the other things that it's really important to do, and it is reflected in some of the areas that are operating the food routes sector. We've got good data on food insecurity now. We've heard from Anna. We've got the survey of Londoners, and as much as it said that it had reduced when clearly it's increased of late. And we've also got a good understanding of the way that the cost of living is impacting on particular communities. What we really want the food routes to do is to make sure that it is prioritising those communities who have the greatest risk of poverty due to cost of living and have the greatest rates of food insecurity. So we will be looking for those who apply to us to make sure that they can show us that they are really reaching those communities who have that high risk. And by communities, I mean those minority ethnic communities, those faith communities, and those deaf and disabled communities who we know are those who are highest hit by both food insecurity, but even more broadly by poverty.
Thank you for that, Deputy. It'd be really interesting to see the data, because a lot of it helps us not make so many assumptions and have accurate answers. We look forward to seeing the data. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Bailey. We are running 15 minutes later than what we had planned originally, and we aim to finish at 12:45 if we can, Assembly members. Let's see if we can do that. We have got a question from Assembly Member Ahmed, then Assembly Garrett, and then Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. My question is directed to Tom Rahilly, the Assistant Director for Communities and Social Policy. It's about the restructure that took place last year. What impact has the restructure within the GLA's Communities and Social Policy Unit had on the Mayor's capacity to address food insecurity issues in London?
Thank you. Just going back to sort of recap on the sort of rationale and the reasons for the restructure, because they were, as sort of pertains to our work on financial insecurity and food insecurity more generally, there were a number of different reasons. So first and foremost, we wanted to kind of strengthen our capacity within the unit for the work that we were delivering on financial insecurity and our work on food insecurity as part of that. As we've heard from all of the evidence from panel members today, the work that we are doing in the GLA is very much thinking about, financial insecurity is the main driver of food insecurity, and so our work is very much wanting to strengthen that kind of broad programme. So we're looking at how we could strengthen that within the team. Within that, we also wanted to kind of embed the broader work on food better within different teams in the GLA, but also we wanted to make sure that we were kind of supporting some of the capacity for coordination across the GLA as a whole, recognising the work on food takes place in a lot of different places. As a result of those changes, we were able to expand the team working on financial insecurity and expand the kind of programme on food insecurity specifically. The food budget as a whole, just as an example, prior to those changes, for across the breadth of work on food was 144,000. Our budget on food insecurity alone this year is 370,000. So we've significantly increased the work on food insecurity as part of those. And within the team, whilst expanding the numbers, we also brought in people with expertise who'd been working in the food aid sector, who'd been working on poverty reduction programmes, and who'd been working in local government in relation to that financial support and advice. So we were able to kind of significantly increase the kind of expertise and capacity within the team as well. The overall support for work across the GLA on food moved as part of that to the GLA Strategy and Communications Directorate, but also brought in the support of the committee services team and to support the running of some of the kind of food boards and others which hadn't been there previously. So strengthening that sort of secretariat support for work across the GLA. Just thinking about the work on food insecurity, we've therefore kind of significantly increased the way in which we are working with the food board. We had a food aid subgroup which actually originally started being convened during COVID, but has actually now become a kind of one of the kind of parts of the way in which the GLA is supported by the Food Aid Board. That group, which is chaired by the chair of the overall London Food Board, has met 6 times during the past year to support our work on development of food routes as a programme, to support our understanding of the risk and the kind of issues of need across London, as well as supporting the overall kind of programme of work on food insecurity.
Thank you. Significant concerns were raised about this restructure last year from the Assembly, and I myself actually raised a number of issues in that meeting last summer. And external organisations also raised their concerns. My colleague, Assembly Member Cooper, in speaking to external organisations, has discovered that what they feared has happened, that strategic work on food seems to have been lost and food policy appears to have been deprioritised as the budget has been cut. The organisation Sustain has also raised concerns that they themselves are now plugging the gap. Has the GLA's capacity for work on food policy been negatively impacted by the implementation of these changes in the light of what I've just said?
So just on budget, I don't recognise the sort of sustained view or figures that the budget for work on food has been cut. As said, prior to changes, the GLA's food budget was 144,000. In my own team's work on food insecurity alone, we're spending £370,000 on food routes and other food insecurity projects this year. And I know that teams across the GLA, whether that's within the health team, the environment team, work on kind of support for the hospitality sector, are continuing programmes of work supporting food. So I'd have to pick up that conversation with Sustain because I don't recognise those figures in terms of cuts to the food budget. as I said, as part of these changes, we have significantly strengthened our own capacity to work on food insecurity, as you know, that is driven by financial insecurity, as we've so powerfully heard today. And so we have expanded that capacity. We also, as I said a minute ago, moved as part of those changes the overall coordination to our strategy and communications directorate with additional support from the committee services team that wasn't there before. It's true that the overall food board has not met as frequently during the past year as it had previously. But what I would say is that doesn't, I think, speak to the way in which members of the food board have been involved and worked in different aspects of food policy across the GLA. So to say, only speaking to the areas which I'm responsible for, we have convened and supported and met the food aid subgroup to advise our work on food insecurity 6 times over the past year. That's involved, as I say, it's chaired by the chair of the overall London Food Board and has brought together local authority partners, VCS partners and members of the food board to co-inform and support that work.
Why hasn't the food board met as often as it could have done?
So, I'd say it has met over the past year. I think it met in May, and there's a meeting of the food board due for the 3rd of November, and that's being led by colleagues in Strategy and Communications Directorate. I'm sure, and you know, and we'll continue that support for those colleagues in doing that. I'm sure members of the committee will understand that during that past year, that you know, all of us across the GLA, my own team and that team as well, have also been supporting priorities around, at the beginning of the year, the continued response to the pandemic, our work on recovery, our work on the cost of the, you know, on financial hardship and the cost of living crisis, and a range of other pressures. So I think that has meant that the board itself has not been convened as regularly as possible. But what I would come back to is that there have been a range of other ways in which we've continued to work with the board and continue to involve them in the development and the support of the delivery of our programmes. And I go back to the meeting of the food aid subgroup, which has met 6 times during the past year.
My concern is that given the role that the Food Board has and the way that it was described to us at the oversight meeting last summer, it's been 6 months since it last met. And given the economic turmoil that you've just referred to, I would have expected it to have met at least once more in that time. And whilst I take on board everything that you've just said about work being done in other ways, this is a key strategic component that does seem to be missing. Given that food insecurity could increase this winter with the current economic turmoil and the handling of it, and we've just heard over the last couple of hours from our panel about how difficult things could become, will additional resources now be given to this work?
Is that a question for myself?
Yes, that's correct. Well, whoever feels best placed to answer that.
And so, we are, as I assume committee members, we're in the midst of kind of our budget kind of process for next year. But if I think and kind of look to the budget for this year, so this year the mayor and the deputy mayor increased our work on financial insecurity and food insecurity as part of that by 3.7 million. That was over a baseline budget for the work of 1.1 million. So we saw a significant increase in this year on the resources that were being put into our work on addressing, the impact of low income and financial hardship in London. And I'd say as part of that, our work on food insecurity. Described the increase we've seen in the budget that is dedicated to food insecurity alone. We are in the process of discussing and kind of finalising proposals for the budget for next and subsequent years. I don't know, Deputy Mayor may want to kind of speak to those priorities within that. But we are, as officers, putting up a range of kind of proposals about actually what do we see as the need in London? What does it mean for the kind of next phases? Deputy Mayor has already talked about the next iteration of the Food Routes programme, which will seek to launch imminently, but actually will continue into future years. But that at the moment are sort of part of the discussions for the negotiation of budgets for future years.
Deputy Mayor, did you want to add to that?
I suppose the only other thing to add is that, as Tom has mentioned, and I think I've mentioned before, because we're so concerned about the drivers of food insecurity, a lot of what we are intending to focus our investment on now will be on tackling broader financial insecurity as a driver of food insecurity. So that's in addition to, obviously, the Food Routes project that we've talked about. It's in addition to the wider support of the London Food Board that you've just been discussing. So we do have quite a few plans, and there's quite a bit of work that we've already launched actually, which is about raising awareness so that individuals know what their rights and entitlements are, so that they can access advice. I know that we've mentioned advice quite a bit here, but advice is one of the key ways I think that we can try to really mitigate for the rising cost of living. And so we are significantly trying to contribute to the advice sector in London, which has an enormous funding gap at the moment. And we're funding very specific types of advice, so welfare advice, legal advice, energy advice, energy-specific advice, and also working really helpfully with the food aid sector to see if there are other ways that we can ensure that people can access advice, because getting advice is difficult to do if you are in debt or if you are afraid, and so we're trying to ensure that we're doing all we can to do that sort of important outreach so that we meet people where they're at, and that's largely where a lot of the investment is going to be.
Thank you, and I fully appreciate that, having met recently with Lambeth Citizens Advice Bureau and the crisis the advice sector seems to be in London. Thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Garrett.
Hello, good afternoon. If I could just briefly pick up actually this question about kitchen social. You did say it was in, sorry Debbie, you said it was in 28 boroughs. I know my colleague pointed out the lumpiness of that. One of the figures that jumped out at me was that Lambeth had 15,000, roughly 15,000 children helped. Croydon and Sutton, is the area I represent, both boroughs combined had 1,000. So Lambeth alone, 15 times more than two other boroughs, one of which, Croydon, is a very large borough. And it seemed to me that you were very happy to sort of talk about that positive programme, and it sounds very positive, didn't really seem to reach my patch very much. I mean, but that went on for years, that disparity of where it was. I mean, were you aware of the extent of the disparity, and that some areas, mentioning no Croydons and Suttons in particular, seem to really get the short end of the stick? And why was that? Were you aware that that was happening, and what did you do to try and rebalance it?
So I think, I guess the best answer to give is similar to the answer that I gave to your colleague, which is that we know that Kitchen Social was actively seeking to work in places where it had those good links. And so I don't know, I have to be honest, about the links that they would have had in Croydon and Sutton. I'm not sure about the extent to which they were working with local community organisations, or if they had those relationships, etc. I think that would be a question for them to answer in respect of that. That disparity, that is quite a disparity. Yeah. You are correct. The only thing that I can suggest, and this is me saying this without having spoken to them first, so obviously treat my words with caution. The only thing that I can suggest is that this was reflective of the way in which those parts of London are represented in the index of multiple deprivation, and the extent to which they were trying to meet levels of need. So the combination of meeting levels of need with possibly the relationships that they had with existing community organisations in those areas may be the reason for that. But I don't know in detail.
I appreciate you're speculating. I'd probably caution against speculating that there's not very much deprivation in Croydon.
I would never ever suggest that there is no.
That's one interpretation of what you just said. But really, my question.
I would never ever suggest, knowing Croydon, I do know Croydon quite well. I would never ever suggest that, and it may well be that that has something to do with, I don't know, the relationship that they have.
Sorry, I appreciate we're short of time, but and you've told us that you don't know. My question is, how come, despite this going on for years and you being in post for years, you didn't know? Did you not make an attempt to find out? Was really my question.
As I said before to your colleague, whenever we've been approached to fund Kitchen Social, it has been in relation to funding very specific things. They have a very mixed funding portfolio, so they are funded by various other groups and organisations. So when they come to us to fund something very specific, it will be about something very specific. Okay. So I wouldn't have asked a question about Pan-London if the reason that we were funding them wasn't about a Pan-London issue. If it was about something very specific that they were needing, and then we would have tried to respond as much as we could do, because we want to support them. We think it's a really good programme, and we're keen for them to continue to do their work.
Fair enough. I think I made my point. So moving on to the food board, which actually was what I was going to ask about. Mr. Rahilly, you spoke just now about how with the reorganisation there was increased support from the Secretariat, and I felt disrespected by that comment, if I can be quite honest, because it then emerged. Well, we thought when we came into this meeting this morning that it had not met at all. So you spoke about how they got this additional support for their meetings, which we thought were not happening at all. I assume only in response to this meeting happening today, we discovered today that there was in fact one meeting. Would it not be fair to say that since this reorganisation, it's sort of just fallen off the radar, the food board? Would that be not a more honest assessment of what's happened?
So firstly, there was absolutely no disrespect meant in any of my comments, and apologies if it in any way came across as such. I suppose two aspects. One, what I was talking about is part of these changes. At the beginning of those changes and throughout the year, support for the food board has received support from the committee services team. Prior to those changes, it was never supported as a formal board.
But they managed to meet. This is my
point.
Why did they just stop meeting?
And I'm coming to that part of that instead of two answers. So just in terms of the support that was there, it had never previously received support as a kind of official board from the GLA. It was supported from policy officers within actually a very small team, a team of 3 people. So I think also just to put in context what the level of support, the size of the food team that was there before, it was 3 people who then became incorporated in that choice to expand our provision around financial hardship and food insecurity as part of that. Okay. So it received that formal support from the committee service team in a way in which it never had done so before. The meetings that it's had, I've said it's met once, speaking to colleagues in the Strategy and Communications Secretary, it has met once over the course of the past year, so that's not in response to this meeting. It wouldn't be possible, of course, to have had a meeting in the past in response to this meeting.
Just to clarify, when we were preparing our briefings, our understanding was that it had not met at all since last September, and we learned today that it met once. So it's the discovery that it met once is what I'm suggesting happened today. The meeting was in May, so I don't think we have a time.
So I obviously don't know where that information came from, but the board has met once and is due to meet again on the 3rd of November, and to an extent just to try and reiterate or kind of talk to some of the points I made before. There are a range of reasons that happened in terms of the different pressures on the team to be able to do that, and yes, it's true, it hasn't met as frequently as it did before. I think all of us would have liked for it to have met more frequently, but I really do want to emphasise the point that actually we have continued to work with the food board in a range of different ways. So the area of which I'm responsible for around financial insecurity, and again I'm repeating the point, we've had those 6 meetings on that with members on that specific topic.
So May to November, that's roughly 6 monthly. Is that the new rota? When is the second, third, fourth, fifth meeting due? Are they programmed in quarterly now?
So within the terms of reference for the food board, it is it's expected to meet quarterly.
But it hasn't.
No, it hasn't. I'm just saying. But I think your question, if I understood it, was to ask about kind of future meetings. So within the terms of reference, it is expected to meet quarterly. And I know colleagues are having conversations with food board members about updating its terms of reference. I don't know. I don't expect that they're expecting to change that, but I think on that 3rd of November meeting, they are with the food board members kind of, checking whether there are changes to their terms of reference they wish to make.
Oh, well, that's not a very positive ending of that sentence.
No, sorry, apologies. It wasn't meant to imply otherwise. I'm just saying that those terms of reference say that it meets quarterly.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I can speak for the committee, but it might be nice if you or they or someone could write to us giving us a schedule of meetings, because presumably they don't just decide ad hoc when to hold them. They presumably have a plan so that people can be available.
And I will speak to colleagues who are sort of coordinating the support for the board as well as the committee services team to do so.
Thank you very much. Debbie, were you aware that it wasn't meeting over this time and you thought that was okay? Did you stage an intervention, or how come there was this long gap?
So, as Thomas mentioned, so I suppose the coordination of the food board has shifted. It was the 3 members, as he rightly pointed out, who were sat within my team, and that's now extended out to others. So I wouldn't have said that it was okay at all, but I'm aware that they haven't met, and it's a shame that they haven't met, but there have been some reasons, and Tom has gone through what those reasons were. They are an important board. They provide enormous expert advice to us. One thing that I think it really is important just to restate, I think that the way...
We are very short of time now.
I know, I'm really
sorry.
I'm very sorry. Can I just state this point? It's actually really important. The fact that it now sits with the strategy team, and that can bring in the environment team, the business team, can bring in our team, and can bring in others who can support the board more effectively and ensure that their work is feeding more immediately into GLA work, I think is a really good thing.
It just all sounds very, to be blunt, it all just sounds very hypothetical, all of these things that could now happen, but for a year, barring May, it just seems to have been absent. And when I asked you if you'd intervened, you said, well, it's a shame. I mean, you're the deputy mayor. Do you not ring them up and go, get together, do something?
May I just add, I'm not the deputy mayor for food. It isn't within my remit.
Is there a deputy mayor for food?
No, there is not.
We are going to move on to this because there's some really important questions that we need to ask next.
Okay, I mean, the other part of the restructure was creating a food champion. Who is that? Has that post now been created?
Yes, there is a person in the Mayor's office who is the food champion. His name's Nathan Daron, and he works in the MPDU, which I know stands for something, the Delivery and Policy Unit for the Mayor.
And when was he? Sorry, Nathan. And when was that post assigned? Was that an existing person assigned an additional? And also will do this, or is that a dedicated person?
So he was assigned that role, I believe, at the point at which this was brought to oversight. So all of the new structures which appeared out of that or occurred as a result of that meeting, that's when he was given the role.
And is there a remit for that role? Is there a sort of plan of what we might expect to be delivered?
He, as far as I'm aware, I know that he meets regularly with the chair of the food board. He has met recently to set the agenda for the upcoming meeting that Tom has mentioned, and he has a good working relationship with Claire Pritchard, who is the chair.
I suppose what I'm getting at is that it's easy to create a post, and that post involves having some meetings and talking to some people, and maybe make a press release. My question is, we've heard about all the problems, and I suppose my question is about delivery.
Sure.
Actions, results.
Sure. So it's actually really helpful that he is the one who is leading the Mayor's policy and delivery unit. So what that does mean is that he has got a keen eye, sort of focused on how we deliver on all of the Mayor's priorities. But also it's incredibly important that him having that role, given that he is in the Mayor's office, means that he has both a political as well as an operational eye over the way in which we support the London Food Board, and that they subsequently advise the Mayor. So it is a good working relationship, and I think importantly, because he is having those meetings, they're not just having cosy chats. They're obviously having really important conversations about the very different ways in which that whole jigsaw that we've been talking about today fits together to ensure that we are properly overseeing the food strategy for the Mayor.
Okay. Well, on that point, actually, London Food Strategy Implementation Plan, I think, dates from 2018. Is there a new one due?
I believe the plan is being finalised at the moment, and that is sitting with the champion. With the food champion himself. I'm sorry,
yes.
That sounds so odd.
Yes, no, it does sound very exciting, doesn't it? It's with the champion. Do we know when the champion might publish it?
So I know that, goodness. So when I say it's been finalised, it has been drafted. So it's going through the sign-off process as we speak.
Okay. And there was another initiative that's been ongoing, is the London Boroughs Food Group. Is that something that's still active?
Yes, I believe it is. Yes, so there are two subgroups which are part of the London Food Board. One is the Food Aid subgroup. One is the Boroughs Food Group. Also, yes.
What are you can guess my question. What are the outputs, achievements of that?
So, I mean, I will pass over to Tom because I know that he has been working very closely with them. But I know that one of the things that we've been able to do with the Boroughs Group is to be able to present to them some of the plans that we have around tackling the cost of living crisis. We've talked to the Boroughs Food Group about the Food Routes programme to make sure that it is as informed by those experts as possible. And I know that they are working closely with the teams, with the other subgroup, the food aid subgroup, because there is a regular food insecurity survey which is conducted to make sure that we have an understanding of the resilience of our food aid sector, and the Boroughs Food Group will have knowledge of the findings of that survey.
Okay. So did you have anything to add, Tom, in terms of the outputs of that group?
It was on that specific point about outputs. I suppose the Boroughs subgroup has a very large membership and actually has always had an agenda that is partly informed by the GLA and the Food Board, and actually partly by that membership itself. And I think if we speak to Food Board members, what they say is very valuable about the boroughs is the way in which it's a forum for boroughs sharing information between themselves or between kind of VCS partners. So that's always been a big part of what members have valued, and as a result, it's always been a subgroup that's sort of co-organised by both the GLA and those organisations and members of the Food Board, and led by them themselves, and that continues to be the case. In terms of a continued meeting, in fact, I think there's a meeting of the group next week. As Debbie says, members of my own team have been to that group to talk about our work on food insecurity. We have done over the past year. We are doing so again. But as I say, it's very much, its kind of primary focus is about sharing practice, something we've heard about from panel members today, between different boroughs, between different kind of VCS organisations and boroughs, and what's going on across London, sort of outwith of what the GLA activity is.
Okay. Just another question on that, actually. I don't know if it's best for you, Tom, or for Debbie, about... so I know that not all of the boroughs are on that board, and I just wondered what the reason for that was. Was it a question of inviting people who then just choose not to participate, or is there something else, a reason why they don't get involved?
So membership is open to all. In fact, membership is open to those beyond boroughs. Actually, the split of membership is roughly, both in terms of those on the total copy list, but also actually if you do analysis who turns up, roughly 50% actually local authority in boroughs and 50% other types of organisations working locally. It is open to all, but as I say, the nature of the forum means it is one about kind of sharing practice and information, and actually therefore if others don't turn up, that is their choice to do so.
Okay, thanks. That's useful. So finally, Debbie, a question about the sort of robust safety net mission, and what else, not the things we've spoken about already, very conscious of time and not wanting to reiterate, but other than those things, what's going on from the Mayor's office in terms of the robust safety net that's dealing with food poverty and food security?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So the robust safety net is one of the 9 missions that report to the London Recovery Board. And importantly, what that mission is seeking to do, working very closely with borough leaders, is to ensure that individuals who are in financial hardship are able to access the hardship grants and the various other services that could be available to them at a borough level. And it was initially set up to enable us to bring all of that information together, to enable us to properly work together with boroughs to ensure that we are covering all bases for those individuals who are on the lowest incomes. And it's been a really successful partnership, because we've been able to have 2 borough leaders. We were up until recently working with the CEO of Toynbee Hall, who was leading the mission. He has now moved on, and he's now the CEO of the Mayor's Fund for London that we've just been discussing. So we will be looking for another individual to take up that sort of VCS aspect of the partnership. But I think the ultimate success has been in the way in which we've been able to work across sectors, because it really is important, I think, on a local level, and the Food Routes programme has helped us to really sort of realise that there are as many avenues to be able to access as possible for support, and some of those avenues will be local authority led, and the only way to ensure that we are enabling people to access them is for us to have a good working relationship with those local authorities specifically.
Okay, I think there was a £3.7 million allocation to that. Is that now largely spent, partly spent? or still plenty left?
So that allocation is for advice, and that hasn't been fully spent yet, no. We have allocated some additional monies to work that we're doing with Citizens Advice and the London Legal Support Trust, and that is enabling us to do some of that capacity building work within the advice sector, because as I mentioned before, not everyone can give good welfare advice. It's quite technical, it's very specialist, and so what we're seeking to do is to try to enable people who want to give advice to be able to give advice. So we're training them to be able to do that, and the London Legal Support Trust are helping us with that work.
Sorry, Tom, did you want to add something to that? Oh, that was my last question.
Just on this question about whether it's spent or not, and just to add to the Deputy Mayor's comment, it's not spent in the sense that we've profiled that budget over the course of the year. So actually, in terms of our expected spend by the end of the year, we expect to spend that 3.7 million. But obviously, we have not spent it all yet because the financial year has not finished.
I should have been clearer. So it's allocated and
it's
in
allocated,
process,
it's in grants, it's in contracts, and actually going through the budget as we have recently done, we're not expecting a particular significant variation on that 3.7 million. It is expected to spend on that, the very important topic of how we're addressing financial hardship this year.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for that clarification, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair. By way of conclusion, Heather, Pam and Sabine, if I can ask you all a two-part question. And really it's what would you like to see the Mayor do about this? And what would be the most important national change that would help tackle food insecurity? And then Debbie, I'll come to you for any final comments on that. So Heather, if I can start with you, please.
Sure, thank you. So I think as we've already talked about really, we would like to see the Mayor take more steps to maximise the take-up of social security benefits, and there's some fantastic work going on already. So that includes benefits advice work. It might also include an awareness raising campaign to make sure that people are making use of all the benefits that they are entitled to, including things like Healthy Start vouchers, pension credits and so on. And then also kind of promoting good practice around local crisis support, particularly, as we've said, adopting cash first approaches on that actually really get money to people so that they can afford the essentials that they need at that point of crisis. And then in terms of the national picture, the most important change right now would be to make sure that the government follows through on its commitment to uprate benefits in line with September's inflation figure. That's extremely important that happens. Because as I said earlier, we're not talking about people who've got flex in their budgets. We're talking about people who are really going to go without food and other essentials if that doesn't happen. And then action to ensure that debt deduction rates from universal credit are reduced and that those repayments are managed in a way that ensures that people can continue to afford the essentials.
Thank you, Heather. Pam.
I suppose from my point of view, the biggest single thing that could happen would be, dare I say, a cultural shift in the relationship between the state and the people in terms of how they use their assets and how they find solutions to what we've just been talking about today. From my point of view, I'm pleased that the strategy is only in draft, because maybe there'll just be something about a right to grow on community land in there, or at least add into, I think it was 0.5 in the 2018 strategy document, but something in there that gives it a bit more teeth and a bit more ambition. And at a local level, for the Mayor to do everything that he can to show some leadership on the repurposing of public realm to feed local people, which is not a marginal activity when we know that 40 to 50% of fruit and veg could be grown on our public realm and in public land. So it's also got an economic driver as well. And nationally, it's the same thing. It's let's line up behind a repurposing of the assets we've got in order to invest in the greatest asset we've got, which is the people. That's it.
Thank you, Pam. Point well made. Sabine.
Yeah, I mean, for us, the focus must continue to be on a cash-first approach to escalating food insecurity. We need to see advice services, number one, advice services invested in, promoted. People need to know where they can get support, and they need to know that support through to maximise their income is the most important way that they can address their financial insecurity. We need to see crisis grants, cash grants available, easily accessible, well promoted in every local authority level. I've said before, some of this, of course, you know, real living wage promoted, prioritised. In people need to be able to earn a decent wage, have job security. I think it would be really helpful to focus on digital exclusion, make sure that people are able to access support when they can't afford, you know, to access phone and Wi-Fi and broadband, etc. I think it would be fantastic if there was a plan drafted to end the need for charitable food aid across London, inspired by the Scottish Government and their work there. And I think, you know, we need to talk about what we can do in the short term, of course, but we need to have the absolute focus on the long term here, and building our way through this so that we can take this a moment of crisis of proving that charitable food aid is unsustainable, to really focus in on what's going to address the root causes of food poverty and food insecurity that is spiralling out of control. And it's no exaggeration, as you heard, to say that. In terms of national policy, you know, absolutely calling for the government to do all they can to increase people's incomes, first and foremost to increase benefits in line with September's rate of inflation. That's the bare minimum, because we know even if that happens, it's still not going to be enough for people to get by. And we need to take this moment again to ensure that the government takes seriously the damage that's being done, the impact that policies are having on people, the length and breadth of this country, and we're seeing people in our food banks from every cohort, every kind of person, every group of person, every age, and this is a calamity, and we need to address this for the long term as soon as possible.
Thank you, Sabine. And I was in Scotland this weekend meeting with government ministers, and I'm really glad to hear you point at their plan, because I think they've really got some good stuff going on there. So thank you. And Deputy Mayor, if I can just come to you just for any final comments, really, or any reflections.
I mean, I suppose the first thing is to say is that I'm really grateful to the committee for bringing this, not just in London Challenge Poverty Week, but making sure that we maintain the raising of awareness of the issue of food insecurity, because I suppose the biggest issue for me is that those individuals who are probably at the sharpest end of this crisis were already living in poverty and financial difficulty before this cost of living crisis began to bite. So it's incredibly important for us to continue to do this work, and so I'm grateful to the committee for allowing us to have the conversation. Everything that has been said by all of our guests, I agree with, absolutely. I think that we do need to do more to promote that cash first approach. I think that we will continue to do so. And what's encouraging is that I'm glad that there are a lot of things that people have said that we are already currently doing. But importantly, there is always more that can be done. So on advice, the advice gap is 13.5 million. We've put 5 million in. And so we will want to continue to do that, but we need government's help. We do need government to invest in our advice sector up and down the country, not just in London. The work on community food growing that has been mentioned by Pam, yes, it's incredibly important, and the Mayor is doing an awful lot of work through the London plan to ensure that, for example, allotments are protected, and that boroughs look for new places that can be used for community growing. So thank you for bringing that to us. And obviously, everything that everyone has said about the lobbying has to continue. I would be incredibly grateful to the committee to join us for some of the lobbying asks that we need to continue to make to government, which are around ensuring we have a robust safety net for those on the lowest incomes, because it is one of the best ways to protect their incomes and to enable them to leave poverty and to enable them to weather the crisis that they currently face. So a lot of the asks around the uprating of benefits to in line with inflation, absolutely. The removal of the 2-child limit and the removal of the benefit cap. These are the asks that we have continued to make. But importantly, given that we've had a really important discussion about kitchen social today, Free school meals eligibility is one of the quickest ways, frankly, that we could try to make some of those differences. If free school meals were eligible to all children living in families where a parent is claiming universal credit, that would make an enormous difference to their abilities to have a hot meal and for those children to be able to thrive whilst they're at school. So those are the sorts of things that we will continue to ask for. And I'm really grateful to all of the panellists for raising those issues. These are things that we are working on. We will continue to do more, and I'm grateful to the committee for allowing us to have this discussion.
Thank you all. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. It's been such an honour to be chairing a committee meeting on such a relevant subject on food insecurity during London Challenge Poverty Week. I'm so pleased that you're able to come today and speak to us. I'd like to thank all our guests for attending the meeting and for their answers today. And Trussell Trust, thank you so much for inviting Sharron. It was really incredible to hear her story and so necessary. I'd like to just quickly go through the ending of the meeting. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the party group leads to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 2022-23 Assembly year?
Noted.
And the next meeting of the Economy Committee is scheduled for 30th November 2022 at 2 p.m. in the Chamber at City Hall. And I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting.